Good morning. My name is Kim Shea, and I'm a member of the Social Studies Department here at Hudson Falls High School. Today's assembly is a commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the attack at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. The Hudson Falls Central School District has a long and important legacy of recognizing the service of our World War II veterans, the greatest generation, as well as those who have served in their footsteps. To all of these brave men and women, we extend our heartfelt gratitude. Joining our Superintendent Daniel Ward and High School Principal James Benefield, our distinguished speakers include Senator Daniel Steck of New York's 45th Senate District and Matthew Ozell, author, World War II historian, and former Hudson Falls High School history teacher. The remarkable collection of newspapers donated by George McKinney, a member of the evening custodial staff, provide context for us to begin to comprehend the devastation inflicted upon the Pacific Fleet, as well as the urgency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speech to Congress on December 8, 1941, in which he asks for and receives a declaration of war against the Empire of Japan. These events mark the entry of the United States of America into World War II. As we begin today's commemorative assembly, please rise and remove your caps for the singing of our national anthem by Senior Olivia Barkham, and stay standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, led by Staff Sergeant Joseph Hart of the Air National Guard and a member of our Physical Education Department. Please rise.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fights o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Ward.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Ward. I'm the superintendent here at the Hudson Falls Central School District. I'm honored to welcome everyone, the small in-person group here in the auditorium, the viewers at home watching through our streaming link, and all the students in our classrooms watching today this program that we can't have in person due to COVID restrictions. But like everything else in America, we will find a way. And so today, this is our way. I'd like to offer my thanks to everyone who played a part in planning this event today, especially Kim Shea. An amazing amount of work done by one individual to make sure that we were able to recognize this 80th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I echo Mrs. Shea's sentiment and gratitude for all that have served and are serving in our U.S. Armed Forces, including one specific deceased Air Force veteran, my father, Chauncey Charles Ward. Admittedly, my knowledge of Pearl Harbor and World War II is mainly limited to what I was taught in junior high and high school many years ago in Fort Ann. Along with my affinity for war documentaries and popular films released in the last 15 to 20 or so years. I have, however, been fortunate enough to actually visit Pearl Harbor, including the Visitor Center, the museum, and my wife, Allison, my daughter, Alexis, and I did take the boat ride out to the USS Arizona Memorial while we were there. That memorial is the resting place of exactly 1,102 sailors and Marines that died on this very day 80 years ago. 1,177 is the total number that died that day. Some had chose to be buried elsewhere. Visiting the Pearl Harbor and USS Arizona Memorial is something that I'll never forget. In my career, I have many opportunities to speak at events like this, including Veterans Days and other items like graduations, where we talk about all that is sacred to the United States and to our citizens. Not admitting that a lot of us have many freedoms that are based upon the service and sacrifice of others who we have never met cannot go unnoticed. This is one of those experiences for me. Having no military experience of my own to reflect on, I often reflect on the sacrifice and service of those other folks who I have mentioned. In the end, the most fitting description and the result of my reflection is gratitude. Where would I be today without all of them? Where would our country be today without all of them? What freedoms would we have? What freedoms would we be lacking? So in closing, let me again provide my sincerest thanks to all that have served or are serving, so that each and every one of us here in the United States of America lives a life full of freedoms, well fought for, in safe and accepting communities. At this time, I'd like to welcome Mr. James Benefield, high school principal, to the podium. Mr. Benefield.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Ward. As I prepared my remarks for this morning's assembly, I kept thinking, from my lens, is what are our students going to think about this assembly? Yeah, 80 years ago, Japan bombed the U.S. naval ships in Pearl Harbor. So why was this event such an important date in the history of our country? Because it is a lesson about grit and resilience our country showed in one of the darkest hours. At the time of the bombing, our country was already in the middle of a great economic crisis, the greatest in our history, the Great Depression. And just as our economy and country were starting to recover, Pearl Harbor happened, during which most of our naval fleet was destroyed. Think about that for a moment. In an already dark time, an even bigger tragedy occurred. How would our country react to this news? In that moment, I'm sure many Americans were in shock and wanted to give up, but they didn't. They dug deep and decided that they would not give in or give up. They would fight back and do whatever it was needed to protect the freedoms that we hold dear to citizens in this great country. I would also like to add that Pearl Harbor thrust our country into World War II, as Mr. Shea alluded to earlier. And in our darkest hour, when our country was thrust into World War II, it would be the youth of our country that would make up the backbone of our military and workforce that would lift our country out of this dark time. Young men and women who were the same age as many of our students here at the high school. Young 17 and 18-year-old young men were allowed to enlist in the military, but many others lied about their ages and enlisted illegally, the youngest being 12 years old. Young women also volunteered for service, although they were not allowed to fight in battle at that time, but they still made many contributions as they served their country during World War II. Many of our young women also went into the workforce in factories because of the need for workers, with men fighting off in the war. My point is that it was the sacrifices of our country's youth that made the victory in World War II possible, including members of the Hudson Falls community. If not for their sacrifices, the war would not have been won. In closing, Pearl Harbor is worth remembering because it defined in many ways what the world, and more importantly, how we see ourselves as a country, which is, when we have the most to lose, we have never lost our courage to stand up to our enemies who seek to attack our people, our country, and freedoms. I would also like to take a moment to remember the soldiers and sailors who lost their lives in serving our country at Pearl Harbor. I'd also would like to thank all the veterans who have served in our armed forces and members of our several military branches who are currently serving our country both here and around the world. It has been said many times, but I will say it again: freedom is not free. It comes from the sacrifices made by men and women of our military. I want to thank everyone for being here today. At this time, I'd like to introduce New York State Senator Mr. Dan Steck, who will like to share a few remarks himself this morning. Mr. Steck.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Ms. Shea, for thinking to invite me. I want to thank George McKinney for his generous donation of these newspapers in front of us here today. You know, the parent of a high schooler myself, mindful of our audience, our virtual audience here, trying to figure out, you know, what am I going to say to a bunch of teenagers that are in the middle of dealing with COVID and their limited life experience, and you know, in the context of today, 80 years ago, as President Roosevelt said, a date that will live in infamy. In today's day and age, you know, if you're watching remotely, the students here, are anything like my teenager, your world, your window on the world, your source of news and knowledge of what's going on, our current events, is through the telephone, or your iPhone rather, and that's where we're getting instantaneous news. But 80 years ago, there was no nightly, you know, news programs that everyone saw. You know, those the pre-Walter Cronkite and the big networks. The news world centered around the newspaper, and the newspapers captured the moment. And it's very easy for newspapers. They don't last forever, and they find their way into the garbage or into the fireplace, and before you know it, they're lost. But every once in a while, you have a family that squirrels things away like this, knowing that someday they might be important, and they get forgotten, lost in a box, and then life happens, and people are going through some family member's box and finding these treasures. You know, congratulations to George and your family for saving these and for donating them to the school, so that students can reflect on this. Why, you know, how do I make the connection to you know, high school students today, and this donation from the McKinney family that captured 80 years ago the tragedy, is because we're all used to saying to veterans, and especially to our greatest generation, we thank them for their service and their sacrifice, and that's certainly true. But I also think now that we need to add a third thing when we start talking to veterans, and in particular the greatest generation. Not only should we thank them for their service and their sacrifice, but for their example. Because we are living in a 2-year nightmare. We're not alone. The whole planet is in this. But it's hard. It's hard for young people that lack a certain perspective on the world to you know, to see how we're going to get through this, or where's the light at the end of the tunnel. You lack that perspective that the greatest generation certainly has, and sadly we're losing more and more of them every day to time. But the country and the world got through World War II, and you know, that was brought on our country by this day 80 years ago in Pearl Harbor. 20 years ago, we similarly were dealt a comparable blow on 9/11, and while we're still dealing with the ramifications of that, we as a country have been able to move on with some normalcy and you know, living our lives here as we try. And now we're dealing with COVID. So these things do come. It's part of history, it's part of life. It's not fun, it's not pleasant. But ignoring it or wishing it didn't happen doesn't change it. But again, perspective to the students that are watching, that while we're in the middle of this pandemic and it's not fun or enjoyable, and it's taken an awful lot from our young people, more I think from you than from us middle-aged guys like me. But I think that this donation and this history that's been captured here today and donated to the school certainly reflects on we've dealt with adversity before. This is how they did it. This is how your grandparents and your great-grandparents, they've been there, done that, and if they can do it, so can we. So that would be the message that I hope people make the connection from these newspapers to today. I've been to Pearl Harbor. I was in the Navy. One of the, I don't get a chance to talk about this part of my service that often. Everyone seems to know that I was in the Navy, but one of the great pleasures of my life, or my time in the Navy, was that I had the honor of driving my ship into Pearl Harbor from the ocean into port. And that was, you want to talk about sending a chill up your spine, being there and seeing that up close. And I've been to the memorial, the Arizona, one of the most powerful places on the planet emotionally, I think, that you could ever visit. And today, if you go visit there, there's also nearby the USS Missouri, which is the ship that the Japanese signed the surrender papers to General MacArthur on. And that battleship, actually, I had a connection to that. That ship was moored in my home port of Bremerton, Washington, when I served there. And so I was on that ship when it was in Bremerton, and I've been on that ship again in Pearl Harbor. So if anyone ever has the great privilege to go visit Pearl Harbor or go visit Hawaii, certainly time well spent, American history, world history, human history, to visit the place where, such an awful tragedy occurred and so many lives were lost, and the symbolism of both that Arizona sitting on the bottom of the harbor with the memorial on top of it, and then, of course, a sister ship, the Missouri, where the surrender papers were signed as a reminder to all of us of the tragedy and the service and sacrifice of so many in World War II. So again, congratulations to the McKinney family for this wonderful collection that you've preserved and donated to the school. And it's a privilege to be with all of you here today. And it's a real privilege for me to introduce Mr. Matt Ozell, author, historian, and teacher, who knows a lot more about Pearl Harbor than I ever will, but it's a privilege to introduce you, Mr. Ozell.
All right. Brandon, can you bring your slide up? Or? All right, warming up. All right. Well, hello, this is Mr. Ozell speaking to you, Matthew Ozell. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to Ms. Kim Shea for her putting together this wonderful event, recognizing 80 years ago today, what happened. I'd like to thank my old principal, Mr. Benefield, our new superintendent, Mr. Ward, Mr. Steck, and of course, George McKinney, who came across these treasures and donated them to the school. As you may be aware, I was a teacher here for 30 years, from 1987 to 2017. I did graduate from Hudson Falls High School in 1979. I told my dad my senior year that I was leaving Hudson Falls and never coming back, exclamation point. Well, 7 years later, I was living in his garage and driving his car up to my old high school, except this time I was on the other side of the desk. And as it turned out, it was meant to be, I think. And what we began here in Hudson Falls in the early part of my career was an oral history project called the World War II Living History Project, because I noticed that when we got to teach World War II, usually it was in the springtime. I taught global history and geography at that time, grade 9 and grade 10. And we literally had like 2 or 3 class periods to teach the entire World War II. And as you know, that's pretty much impossible. And it's really hard to cherry pick things. But I got smart one day. I asked the kids, actually it was on a whim, how many of you had a grandparent, or in some cases a parent, an aunt and uncle, mom even, who served in World War II? Every single kid's hand went up in the classroom. Again, this is the late 1980s, early 1990s. 2 hands would go up because they knew more than one grandparent who served. So I created a simple 2-page survey. I gave it to the kids. I said, bring this home and ask these questions to your granddad or whoever, or fill it out yourself, or have him or her fill it out. And I bribed them with extra credit, and that got the job done. So I collected about 50 or 60 of these surveys before we started to invite these veterans into the classroom. And thematically, we began to have symposiums in our high school library. In the early days of the internet, we would try to broadcast them live. And I did them thematically, and I can remember on several occasions we had our Pacific veterans come in. A lot of former Marines, guys who were in the Navy, pilots, John Leary in particular, flying in the Battle of Midway, for example, Guadalcanal veterans. And during a break one day, they started to talk about a kid from Hudson Falls. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about that kid in the slideshow, or excuse me, in my little mini lecture here. Anyway, we see some photographs. I don't know if you can see them in the classroom. You don't need to have the camera on me necessarily, but here you see Battleship Row. The previous slide showed the boat's positions around Ford Island there on the morning of December 7th, 1941. And the attack started about 5 minutes before 8 o'clock, okay? So I'm not sure when your block float 4 starts, but I remember it was around in the afternoon, around 12:50, 12:55. Today is gonna be the moment that the attack started 80 years ago. They're being 5 hours behind us. So that's when most of our veterans heard about this bombing of Pearl Harbor. It was in the afternoon. And because a lot of our guys were New York Staters, obviously, a lot of them were actually listening to the Giants football game on the radio when the news cut in. And the reaction, and again, when I sent students out into the community to interview our World War II veterans, no matter where they served, we always started with, do you remember where you were and what you were doing when you heard the news about Pearl Harbor? And 99.5% did remember. Another universal reaction they had, though, was they didn't know what Pearl Harbor was. In some cases, they thought it was a who, Pearl being a girl's name. But a lot of these guys would find out, because when they shipped out to the Pacific, they'd have to go through Pearl Harbor. Even years later, we're still recovering these wrecks. It's pretty dramatic stuff. A painting shows the attack underway. The ship you see in the foreground, I think, is the USS Oklahoma, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about that and this kid from Hudson Falls that I sure didn't know about when I was in high school. Again, captured Japanese footage of the attack underway. Big explosion there. That's probably the Arizona. She literally was hit with a bomb that weighed over 1,000 pounds. It hit right in the ammunition magazine. It lifted the boat out of the water. It broke it in half, and it dumped it back into the harbor with 1,177 men who were killed. And many of those men are still entombed in the Arizona today. There were something like over 20 sets of brothers who were killed on the Arizona. That's definitely the Arizona. Okay, that's Hickam Field, which is on Ford Island. So pretty dramatic stuff. Pretty dramatic stuff. Horrible, horrible stuff. A lot of these poor sailors died of their injuries. They were burned. They jumped into the water when several of these ships were attacked, and the water was on fire. They were horribly burned. Pretty traumatic. 8 hours later, in the Philippines, the Japanese struck. Wake Island was also struck.
shortly after Pearl Harbor. So this quote-unquote sneak attack had been in the planning for months. So I'm bringing you up to the Oklahoma, and all these fires you see burning were after the Oklahoma was struck, because the Oklahoma was actually hit first, and that's the boat that this 19-year-old from Hudson Falls was on. And that's who I'm going to talk about. That's Battleship Row again. Japanese photographs. Death of a battleship. This is the Oki. It capsized after taking its 5th torpedo in 10 minutes. It was one of the first ships that was struck. The Japanese dive bombers were releasing torpedoes from underneath their airplane wings. She capsized at 8:08, which will be at 1:08 this afternoon. 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, hundreds of men were trapped below her decks. They found themselves in a bizarre world turned upside down in pitch black darkness. 429 officers, sailors, and Marines died on this ship. That's the Oklahoma. The Oklahoma had quite a history to it. This photograph is from 1940. And in 1936, during the Spanish Civil War, she evacuated a lot of Americans from Spain. And our 19-year-old from Hudson Falls, when he was 18, he was assigned to this ship in the summer of 1940. Okay, so here you see a graphic that shows the torpedo striking the Oklahoma and what happened and how long it took. Okay, now, I'm going to show you a book up here. And this book is called The Story of World War II. It's an oral history. It's pretty fat, it's like 600 pages. But I found an account that I would read every single year, at least for the last 10 or 12 years, to my high school students, and I did it every December 7th. So if anybody's watching at home and you were one of my students, this will sound familiar, but it's an account of a sailor who was on this ship. And our 19-year-old from Hudson Falls was also on this ship. Okay, so here we go. Having returned to port following sea maneuvers only the day before, and I'm talking about this ship, the Oklahoma, the ship had its anti-aircraft ammunition locked away and normally closed watertight compartments below the waterline open in preparation for a fleet admiral's inspection the following Monday, the 8th. Barely minutes into the attack, as the air bases at Hickam and Wheeler Fields billowed smoke and flames and Battleship Row was coming under fire, the Oklahoma was struck by 3 Japanese torpedoes dropped from low altitude. More would follow. Crew members actually saw the torpedoes in the water with virtually no time to react. The explosion ripped through the port side with Randy, our 19-year-old from Hudson Falls, and over 400 others trapped below her decks. The order was given to abandon ship, but as the ship listed and more torpedoes were taken into her port side, the men below deck were plunged into darkness as water flooded into the open compartments. In desperation, many tried to make it to the shell deck, from which it might be possible to reach the top of the ship and jump overboard, as oil from damaged machines slickened the surfaces while the ship was rolling in the water. Dozens of 1,400-pound shells broke loose from their tie-downs. Sailors screamed as the shells barreled toward them, and they were crushed to death. When the ship took her 5th torpedo, she capsized completely at 8:08. A frantic rescue operation by civilian shipyard crews with jackhammers and torches along the bottom of the ship, now above the water, over the next 2 days saved some 32 men, but it was beyond hope for most trapped below the waterline, where banging would be heard for several days. The destruction of the Oklahoma had taken all of 15 minutes, yet it would take Herculean efforts over the next 18 months to recover the sailors' remains. Okay, now I'm gonna read an account from a guy who was actually on the Oklahoma when it was struck, and he was trapped underneath. But first, I want to clarify one thing that Mrs. Shea asked me to do, and that's this. A lot of these Pacific Marines, especially when I talk to them, they use the word Japs, okay? And these newspaper headlines, I didn't have a close look at the ones that are up here. You're gonna see it. I had them hanging in my classroom. Japs bomb Pearl Harbor. Japs take Manila. Well, Mr. Robert Addison, who was a Marine, tough as nails on Guadalcanal, he writes in a footnote in my first book here, Mr. Addison explained for our young people, when I am referring to our enemies as quote-unquote Japs, for us then, well, we call them Japs. Nowadays, I refer to them as Japanese people. And I believe some of our Marines had family members who married Japanese girls, for example. So anyway, this is from Volume 1, Voices of the Pacific, the Things Our Fathers Saw. Okay, so here's the account, and I know time is of the essence here, so I'm gonna speed it up a little bit. This is by a man named Stephenbauer Young, who was from Massachusetts. He was 19. On the morning of December 7th, I was in the living compartment of the gun crew of Battleship Oklahoma's number 4 gun turret, one deck below the main deck. There were 30 or so of us there. I was preparing to go on liberty as soon as I finished my duties as a mess cook. It was a beautiful Sunday, a perfect day for going to the beach and doing some surfing. Our ship, along with much of the Pacific Fleet, had been at sea on maneuvers. We had our anti-aircraft locked away. All the doors were open for the inspection that was going to come on Monday. The watertight compartments below the waterline were open. So anyway, around 8 o'clock that morning, an announcement came over the ship's speaker system. Man the anti-aircraft batteries, man the anti-aircraft batteries. This stunned us. Why were we having drills on a Sunday and in port? What the hell's going on? The sailor who manned the anti-aircraft guns flew to their battle stations, but our station was in the number 4 gun turret, and our 3 big 14-inch guns couldn't be used against aircraft, so we stalled momentarily and looked at each other. Then, almost immediately, there was another announcement. All hands, man your battle stations. This is no shit, goddammit. Jap planes are bombing us. Ensign Herbert Rama, our chief turret officer, had just seen a torpedo from one of the Japanese planes slam into a cruiser and had instinctively raced the ship's general announcing system and given this warning. This is not Navy protocol, Navy language, but it sure got everyone's attention, and we raced toward our battle stations in the turret. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how the gun turret was set up. The enormous 1,400-pound projectiles were hoisted up into the gun chamber from the shell deck, where more than 150 of them were stored standing on end in cradles latched against the bulkhead with light rope preventing them from flipping over. As they were loaded into the breeches, powder bags from the powder handling room 4 decks below were sent up on the hoist room where I worked. We then sent powder into the gun chamber where it was loaded with projectiles. It was possible to enter the turret from topside through a small hatch, and from there scramble down through the turret to your station. But I preferred to enter from below through a heavy steel door in the powder handling room and climb a ladder to my station. That morning, as I raced to the lower entrance of the turret with the other men, I felt the ship jump and then shake. We had been hit by a torpedo from a Japanese plane, but we all thought we had been bombed. It's the Japs, the friggin' Japs, a sailor up top yelled down the hatch. The shit's hit the fan. By the time I got to the next deck, we were hit below by another torpedo and our lights went out. Complete darkness. But someone had a flashlight, and we knew our way so well that there was no problem going down the ladder to the level of the entrance of the gun turret. There was a ladder there, and I scrambled up through the powder handling room to the shell deck. The auxiliary lights came back on. We all thought we were safe there for a moment, 4 decks down and protected by the heavy armor or the gun turret. And nobody thought an airplane could sink a battleship. But then the ship started to list badly as water poured into the gaping holes in her side, surging through the blisters and all the open hatches that normally were closed. Then we started to hear terrible noises. The tremendous stress of the water began to twist and break up the ship. It sounded as if the old battleship was groaning in pain. We also heard crashing noises as bunks, mess tables, lockers, dishes, everything began to be thrown around. We could hear the screams of sailors caught in the path of rushing water or the direct force of the torpedo blasts. We didn't know it, but the Oklahoma, our home, was mortally wounded. As the water began to reach us, sailors slammed down the watertight door to the powder handling room. The entire turret was now watertight. It was less than 3 minutes since we'd been called to our battle stations. I was moving up to the turret with some of the other men, and we ran into Ensign Rommel. He was very excited. He told us to go below to the powder handling room. We couldn't fire our big guns anyway, and we would be safer there. So I climbed back down and joined 20 or so sailors there. The ship was then hit by another torpedo, number 3. We are now listing 25 or 30 degrees, and water started to come into the lower side of the compartment. At the same time, we were being drenched by oil that came pouring down from the damaged machines in the shell deck above, and this made the floor dangerously slippery. We knew we had to get up to the next deck, the shell deck, as soon as possible, for the ship was sinking. From the shell deck, it was possible to climb to the top of the ship and jump overboard. As the ship listed hard, everything that was not tied down went rolling and smashing along the slippery steel deck of the powder handling room. Sailors were slipping and sliding and falling down. As I clung to a bulkhead for support, I looked at the face of my shipmates. Men looked scared and unbelieving. Then there was another hit, the 4th torpedo. The ship rocked and shuddered. Water poured from up above, down through the openings in the decks and the spaces overhead, portholes, hatches, as the ship heeled well over on her port side. We tried to hold on to anything that would keep us above the water. Several sailors lost their grip and fell into the oily water and lay there still. I could do nothing but hold on desperately. Sailors started up the ladder one at a time. I was right behind them, but the ladder was so jammed it was impossible for me to move. I could hear noises from the crew manning the shell deck. As the ship listed, the cradles holding the big shells started to swing. When I saw all those shells rocking back and forth in their cradles on the shell deck and heard men yelling, I jumped off the ladder onto a bulkhead, grabbed a piece of iron, held on for dear life. Then the 1,400-pound projectiles broke loose from the rope lashings. The last thing the men on the shell deck saw was dozens of huge steel shells rolling down the deck at them. They screamed as they were crushed to death. Then it got real quiet. We looked up, but we couldn't see. The hatch had been knocked shut. Our shipmates were crushed to death, we knew. Later, I learned that 3 of my best friends were killed on that shell deck. At that moment, several sailors realized that there's only one way out, through the hatch door by which we'd entered the powder handling room. "Get the goddamn door open," somebody yelled. "We got to get out of here." But the ship was rolling over and the door was quickly getting out of reach as it rose above our heads with the listing of the ship. It was also tightly secured, and we didn't have the proper tools to open it. But somehow the men forced it open. A couple of them managed to make it topside before the ship went completely over. The water poured down on them, but they made it, struggling, choking, gasping for air, not able to see in the pitch dark. "God help me," one guy said as he went through the hatch. On the other side of the handling room, a dozen or so of us were making our own fight for survival. We couldn't get to the hatch in time. We thought maybe we could get up the ladder to the shell deck and force the hatch open. Just then, the emergency lights went out. The darkness was absolute. Several of us struggled to open the hatch, but the shells must have jammed it shut. We were trapped. We were going to die. At that moment, the ship took her 5th torpedo and rolled over, and a great big mass dug into the mud of the bottom of Pearl Harbor, 40 feet down. Her lower starboard side and bottom remained a few feet above the water, we learned later, but at that moment I was so disoriented by the darkness and wild confusion about me, I didn't even realize that the ship had capsized. I felt the ship lurch, the deck slipped out from under me, and my hands snatched at empty air. I was tossed and spun around, pitched into great nothingness, suspended in air as the ship turned about me. The water roared in and took me under. I surfaced, gulped for air, and began to tread water. I was amazed to find myself still alive. There were 2 or 3 dead bodies floating in the water. Just then I heard my friend Bill Popeye Shelf cry out, "I can't swim. So long, boys." And he continues on and on, page after page, until finally, after several hours, Yet, though we had nothing to eat or drink for almost a day, amazingly, I was not hungry or thirsty. Our watches had been broken, and we had lost all track of time, yet it didn't seem to matter. We were in a kind of limbo zone, semi-conscious between waking and sleeping. Then all of a sudden, we heard a hammering sound in short bursts somewhere in the ship. I sat straight up, and I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Was somebody trying to get to us? The rapping noises stopped, but a few minutes later, they started again. My whole body tensed up. This went on for a couple of hours. The first noises coming closer and closer, then silence. Someone said it was pneumatic air hammer. They were trying to get us and cut us out. Frantically, we banged the SOS with a hammer, louder and louder, to let them know where we were. All of a sudden, we heard the rescuers break through to the men in the radio compartment. "There's some guys trapped in there," I heard one of the radio men say. "We'll get them," a confident voice replied. We were going to live. Okay, so you have to remember, this ship is completely turned over. These guys are trapped. How do you get out of the ship? You have to literally swim down, find your way out if you can, and then swim all the way back up. But thankfully, there was a shipyard worker named Juan Castro with his crew, and they began to drill holes in the bottom of the ship. Okay, so this thing's underwater. You ever do the experiment where you're trying to hold water, you press it in a straw, you have your thumb over the end of it, and you pull it up, and then you release your thumb from the end of the straw, and all the water drops out? Well, this is what's gonna happen when they start drilling the holes in the bottom of the ship, except the water that hasn't completely covered the men inside the ship, it's just gonna start to fill up from the bottom. So as soon as they punch that first hole in the bottom to cut these guys out, that water inside the ship is now rising. He drilled a small hole through the bulkhead only inches from where I was. Now at least we could see, but just then we heard a violent hissing sound. Trapped air had begun to rush out of the tiny hole in the bulkhead, and water started coming up in a torrent. It was jetting in through the watertight door we hadn't thought necessary to close. The sudden reduction in air pressure in the air pocket caused by the hole the rescuers had drilled was allowing water to pour in and flood the area. There was no longer any opposing pressure to hold back the waters of Pearl Harbor, and what little air that we had to breathe was escaping through that hole. Castro kept assuring us, "Keep calm, young men, we'll get you out." At last, they cut us out. It was a race against time. He boosted me out to the next level. When I got out to the bottom, which was now the top of the ship, the air was fresh and the sun was shining. As we crawled out of the overturned ship, the sailors on the battleship Maryland, which had been tied next to the Oklahoma, cheered. We waved back and then smiled. We stood on the Oklahoma's bottom, oil-covered and almost naked. Okay, so here you see the Maryland, and you see the upside-down Oklahoma, and this is before these guys got out. As our launch moved across the harbor, past the sunken West Virginia and the still smoking wreckage of the Arizona, we were too shocked to speak. It would take time to realize the enormity of that attack at Pearl Harbor, but we all knew that nothing would ever be the same for us. The world had changed. We knew that at the time, we really did. By the way, when DeCastro got back to his shop in the Navy Yard after 27 hours, he was called to task for putting in too much overtime. Later, he received the Navy commendation, though. He was a civilian. Okay, so the Okie lost 429 men. And here you can see, that's March 1943. This is 18 months later, or about that. And they're trying to right the capsized Okie. And Navy divers went into the ship and cleaned up as much of the remains as they could. There was badly decomposed sailors, obviously, Marines, officers, etc. And their remains were commingled for a long time. So on that day, 2,403 lost their lives. And there you go. Japanese kind of got off easy here. And some of these guys thought the war was over. They thought there's no way we're going to win this war. So here's the boy I want to conclude with, okay? I'm sitting in Hudson Falls High School. I got a bunch of Marines and Navy guys. We're talking about the Pacific Theater. We were on a break, and I overheard them talking about this kid. Do you remember Randy Holmes, they said. And geez, that was the first time I ever heard of him. So they said, yeah, didn't they dedicate the yearbook to him? Class of 1942, that was the class he was supposed to graduate with. He left school early, and sure enough, they did. So I went down into the vault. Mrs. Murray had the keys. I went down into the vault where they store all the old yearbooks, and I found it, and I copied it. And I started to wonder, whatever happened to this kid, right? He didn't come home, as far as I knew. Well, where's his body? Where's he buried, right? Okay, so I actually conclude my first book with this story of Randy. I actually started with Randy too, because he was there, right? Randy Holmes was a couple years older than Jesse when he died. I had a student named Jesse, and Jesse raised her hand one day, and it was around Easter, I forget what year it was, and she said, Mr. Ozell, I'm leaving school early. Can I please have my assignments? I'm going to Hawaii on vacation, Easter break, okay? So she's gonna take an extra few days off, and I'm stuck here in Hudson Falls. So I was a little ticked at her. So I said, yeah, I got an assignment for you. Find this kid that I've been talking about, Randy Holmes. And she did. And then we found out that Randy has a grave in Hudson Falls. I didn't know this. And my last year here, I took the students there for like 20 minutes. It wasn't real hard. Oh, it is hard to schedule a bus. As you know, the transportation department does a heroic job, and somehow in this holiday rush, we went there on December 7th, they managed to squeeze in a 20-minute trip. So I took my seniors there, and we left Little Pebbles on Randy's Stone, and I'm going there right after this ceremony. If anybody wants to come with me, meet me at the door. He's right up the street in Mount Street Cemetery, and he's next to his two parents. He had a sister. The sister moved on. I did try to contact the daughter of the sister, would have been Randy's niece. She lives in Florida, but I haven't heard back from her yet, because I want to know if Randy's been identified. They have made leaps and bounds, as you know. Here's a page, and we're putting a flag on Randy's grave in 2017. Page major. And there's little Jesse. Jesse and I shared this. No, Jesse, she found him. She found his name on this placard. He's in the Punch Bowl National Cemetery, where a lot of remains from our Pacific warriors wound up, many of them unknown. And he was buried commingled in a mass grave. So tragic. But how many of you watching in the classroom knew that we had a hometown boy who was one of the first boys killed in World War II? Pearl Harbor. How many of you knew that he was there? I sure didn't when I was in high school. But Jesse found his name, and later on I found out, guess what Jesse's birthday is? December 7th. Yeah, there are no coincidences. I say that many times, and I've worked with these Holocaust survivors, American soldier liberators, World War II veterans, and the stories are frankly amazing. I've written 9 volumes. I'm not here to plug my books for myself, but I do have a hardcover set for the Hudson Falls High School School Library, including volume 1 that has Randy's story in it. Okay, so I'll give them to school, and once they get processed, you guys can check them out. They're darn good books, by the way. So I would say, do you have any questions? But I guess you can email them to me or whatever. I'd be happy to answer them. And at this time, I guess I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Shea again. Thank you.
As our assembly concludes this morning, I'd like to extend our thanks to those members of the press who were able to join us this morning, certainly to our guest speakers, Senator Daniel Steck, Mr. Matthew Ozell, but especially a very, very special thanks to George for presenting the Hudson Falls Tiger family with the McKinney Collection. Thank you so much. That concludes our virtual assembly. Folks in the classrooms, thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful day.